10-gram mushroom trip report, sent in by a subscriber. A few months ago, I decided to take 10 grams of mushrooms. I came to this decision because for the last few trips, I'd been increasing the dosage but didn't have any new realizations. In fact, the deepest insight I had up to that point came from the first time I ever took shrooms, and the dose there was only 1.7 grams. I think in many ways, I was trying to recreate that experience by increasing the dosage. This time, I'd be sure the dose wasn't the limiting factor. All my prior trips occurred in nature, taking walks or being driven around. I'd heard of tripping blindfolded and decided that's what I'd do this time. I told my mother I'd be tripping and that I'd be doing it in my room so that she doesn't disturb me. Before the ingestion, I made a playlist of the music I'd be listening to on the trip. I put some songs in there that I'd never actually listened to but heard a clip of and felt they're trippy enough. Everything was in place, and so I took the shrooms. There was so much of them that I couldn't do it in one mouthful. The taste was never to my liking, and this time it was especially so. After taking the second mouthful, I felt nauseous. A feeling of excitement and nervousness had come over me. The sheer volume of the meal made some alarm bells go off in my brain. But I calmed down, the nausea was gone, and I was sitting on the bed in my room, waiting for the effects to begin. Since I didn't want to waste the playlist while I wasn't under the influence, I put on some random jazz on YouTube. The first thing that gave away that it was starting was that a musical phrase in a song sounded particularly repetitive. I thought to myself, okay, let's go. Put the blindfold on and the headphones and put on the meticulously chosen playlist. I don't remember the come up all too well, but I knew I was enjoying the music. One of the songs in the playlist that I'd never heard before was Pink Floyd's Echoes. I was loving it, especially the middle groovy part. However, unbeknownst to me, the song has a dark, haunting section. As it started, I tried to withstand it by telling myself, I'm fine, just keep calm and this part of the song will pass. A few minutes in, and I'd had enough. I ripped my headphones off and the blindfold, and was back in the familiar surroundings of my room. Very suddenly, I was extremely sober. I mumbled to myself, wow, it's irresponsible to put that in there, referring to the music, as if it had been written for my trip. I tried getting up, but realised my balance wasn't as good as I thought it was, and so I sat back down, put everything back on, and some new music as well. This is where the trip really started. The usual wave-like nature of tripping was nowhere to be found, and from here on out, it was a steady crescendo. This is where I lost time perception, so the following events are not necessarily in the right order. I started to blend in with the music. There was no boundary where I stopped and the music started. Everything was one. All my senses were appearing in the same dimension. I was moving my hands and feet as if I were the conductor. These movements were themselves part of the beautiful object. Every few moments, I was surprised that the intensity could actually increase. The usual advice to relax into the experience had no meaning. It couldn't be applied any more than advice to avoid burns could be applied on the surface of the sun. I started feeling this boundless love for everything. I thought of my father, who died half a year earlier, and I started crying. He knew he was dying, so I remembered noticing fear and worry throughout his last weeks. I just wanted to show this to him, what I was experiencing right now. If I could only show him how beautiful it can be. Then, I thought of my mother, and how I don't show her that I love her enough. Yet again, I was crying, and wanted to hug her so tight I'd probably break her ribs. My attention then turned again to the music. I knew the kind of music that should be playing, but I was surprised that I couldn't recognise it. What should have been a simple, straightforward blues sounded like something being played by 10 orchestras. Here was a piece of music I'd listened to hundreds of times, and yet it was so much more beautiful than before. How did I miss this? Do I miss beauty like this in every moment? This realisation of how closed my eyes usually are to beauty in plain sight made me cry once more. As impossible as it sounds, things were still getting more and more intense. My visual field was in a complete whiteout. It felt like love was tearing apart the fabric of consciousness itself. I was laughing and crying at the same time. Every pixel of awareness was shining with the intensity of the sun. I remember having some sort of realisation and thinking to myself, how do I explain this to others? And then a moment later realising, how can I hide this? I couldn't even if I wanted to. Funnily enough, I can't remember what it was now, but the insights kept on coming. There was a pervasive feeling that all of consciousness is one, the exact same thing. I remembered a friend with whom I talked about things of that sort, and was firmly convinced that if I could talk to him, I would easily convince him that we are the same person. The intensity had subsided a bit, or so I thought, but the depth was still there. What's the difference between existence and non-existent anyway? I had some intuitive answer to this question that I couldn't put into words, but I felt it in my gut. The closest thing that I can remember now is that they are the same thing, like two sides of the same coin. Even though none of this makes too much sense to me now, at that moment, the feeling was of profound clarity. I remember at some point or another thinking that I was God, and everyone else was God too. It was as though this is something I forgot but could now remember. I knew I'd forgot it again, but I was fine with that. At some point my mother came into my room and all I could tell her was I loved her. Then I remember staring at my hand and it was disappearing as if a black hole was at the centre of my consciousness and was sucking everything in. Everything that makes me was starting to disappear, and it wasn't so fun anymore. I was suddenly on the wrong side of all this. I sat up on the bed and looked out of the door of my room. It had gone dark outside and the light was on in the living room. My room felt like a dungeon. I sat up again, not knowing that I laid down at all. I was now stuck in this loop. It felt like I lived through all this a million times. Oh my god, I've gone insane. I heard people can go insane, but now I'm actually one of those people. My mother has a madman in her flat. My mother came into my room a few times and asked if I was okay, but all I could say was, I want it to continue. She had no idea what I was talking about, but was visibly worried. I just wanted normality to continue. I was begging to have back my unenlightened, dull mind. My friend called me on the phone and asked how the trip was going. I just grunted something like, wow, and sighed. He asked was it good or bad, and I replied, it's not good right now. He started giving me the before mentioned standard advice. Just let it be, relax into it, and so on. I told him to stop saying these things because in my mind I was hanging on by a thread, and if I took his advice I'd completely spiral into insanity. He made me promise to call my girlfriend. After we hung up, I tried operating the phone but was completely unable to do so. The loop I was in kept repeating and repeating. I'd sit up, walk a bit around my room, and sit down again. There were still waves of insight, but at that point I couldn't tell them apart from the psyche of a madman. I was undeniably in a bad trip now. I started thinking that everything that could ever happen will happen. Consciousness will take on every form it can, and this means that somewhere, in some universe, I will live a life of pure misery. I don't know how much influence there was from a TV report on the Ukraine war that was playing in the background, but I started picturing myself being tortured. I was absolutely certain that I'd have to live through all of this. In the midst of all this, I got a call from my girlfriend, since the news of my bad trip had spread from my friends to her. She asked me if I wanted to come over. I did, but didn't want to say it, because if I admitted I needed help, then all this was somehow more real than before. In the end, I caved and told her to come over. I headed into the living room where both my mother and my brother were sitting down. I wasn't sure how bad I looked to them. Later, they told me I was constantly repeating things like, why doesn't it just continue? My normal life, that is. The dread of having to live through all the possible bad things that could ever happen was at times interrupted by the realization that the worst part of all this was the actual panic and dread I was feeling at this moment, so it's almost like I already managed to live through it. But then, the horror returned, and this loop continued a few times. I then looked at my brother's face to try and find clues if I'd really gone mad. He was watching a basketball game and seemed disinterested. I took his calm demeanour to mean that I'd lost my mind a long time ago, and that my insanity was no news to him. Was my life just a figment of my own imagination? I sat down on the floor and lived through a bit more of this. And then, in a moment, everything returned. I was sane and good again. I sat up and said, I'm good, with a sigh of relief to my mother. But as I was saying those words, everything was just gone again. All my knowledge. I kept reassuring myself, I'm back, as if saying those words would help me. My mother was looking at me so as to give myself more reassurance, and I asked her, Em's coming over, right? Referring to my girlfriend. Em? Who? At that point, all my ships had sunk, and I was absolutely sure I'd imagined my own girlfriend. I don't know if she's coming over, my mother said. More relief. I didn't imagine her. She's a real person. But did I imagine talking to her before? A minute later, and the doorbell rang, and I opened it immediately. She entered the house, said hi to my mum and brother, and asked how I was. I didn't know what to tell her. I was still on the seesaw of insight and horror. In one moment, I was sure the most horrific things will start happening. In the next, I was contemplating what to do now that I knew everything. Just live an honest and good life, trying to help as best you can. But how can you do this when there's so much misery in the world? Misery that I'll have to go through. And on it went, the loop. One thing that kept me sane was the clock on the kitchen stove. At least time was still moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, the bad patches were getting worse and violent thoughts started appearing. I'd feel like I can control in which of the branches of possibility the universe will go, and then when something appeared that I didn't control, I'd go in the complete opposite direction, thinking I can't control anything, including myself. If everything's going to happen, then there's a universe where I kill everyone in this house. No, this can't be that universe. Then, as if from another entity, came the thought, well, if it's going to happen, you might as well do it fast. I was so scared I might do something horrible at that moment. My girlfriend was on the phone with the friend that originally called me. He told her to give me some diazepam, which would bring me down. She relayed the idea to me, and I was immediately convinced. I told her I have some in my car, and she went to search for it. I started feeling sleepy, almost lethargic, and when she finally gave me the drug, I immediately went to bed. After this, I started to feel a bit more like myself. My girlfriend lay next to me, and we talked silently. The conversation was good for my mind, and for the first time in ages, I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. As I returned to sanity, I felt great. Calm, grounded, and more of myself than before. I told my girlfriend repeatedly that I loved her, and the experiences I've had on this trip. She took a picture of us and sent it to my friends so they knew I was okay. When I fully got back to normalcy, I went back to the living room and told my mum I was okay as well. She was relieved, and we hugged. I don't think I'd ever felt such gratitude to just being myself. All in all, it was a great trip, and I even learned a lot from the horrible phases as well. It really made me appreciate what it must be like to be an insane person, and it's not an experience I can recommend. The main takeaway from the trip was to just try and be the best person I can, and be honest with the people in my life. However, as good as the trip was, I'm not going to be doing that kind of dose anytime soon, maybe ever. The mind is too precious an instrument to throw away.